When it comes to the topic of Roe v. Wade, I think the overturning of it was a disaster for this nation. I think just like from a moral, like ethical principle point of view, the idea that, oh no, we should leave it up to the states makes little to no sense to me, especially in the context of should the state really have a say in your bodily autonomy? Don't we all have rights regardless, or that go above the state when it comes to our right to ourselves and our body, essentially? I think that we should definitely codify Roe into law. I'm not disagreeing with that part. But I do think the general populace as a whole agrees with the idea that, like, hey, we should have more leeway when it comes to abortion, that total or even like basically total or almost full partial abortion bans are way out there, not what the general populace wants. And we've seen that again as a reaction to the supposed red wave that was supposed to happen, as well as other like local legislative legislative elections. So that's where I currently stand. Those are my opinions, my thoughts.
We'll get into it as we go. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate it. So let's talk about it. It has been overturned, whether we like it or not, and it has been kicked back to the states. Many states have been, I think, pretty reasonable about it. They've put it up to the constituents of the state, whether or not it should be codified into their constitution. But then we have some outliers states. So to Jebtan and Lactoid, the first question's for you. Given the fact that we have seen some pretty horrendous laws, in my opinion, personal opinion here, in Texas and Alabama, for example, counting IVF as children, like in vitro fertilization eggs as children. Do you worry that maybe the federal government needs to step in some of these extreme cases? What do you think?
Um, Lactoid may have a different opinion, but no, not really. I think that you are kicking it to the people by putting it to the states. Obviously, right now you're going to see the snapshot image of what state governments want right now. And like the Democrats said, apparently this has been fueling a crazy blue wave, and all the states are going to flip blue, and they're going to that'll make them change their state laws to what the blue people want. But I don't think it'll happen that severely. But yeah, certainly I expect those state laws to change as different people come in and get elected, just like all state laws change. Roe v. Wade being in existence for the last 40 years has been the reason why that evolution hasn't been allowed to happen over the past 40 years. State laws haven't had the right to change with public opinion over the past 40, 50 years because Roe v. Wade has kept them from being able to legislate it basically at all. So any snapshot issue that we're having because of overturning Roe v. Wade is due to the restriction on state law imposed by Roe v. Wade. If the states were allowed to set these laws 40 years ago, maybe they'd have changed by now, but they haven't been challenged yet. So
What do you think, Lactoid?
So the reason why a lot of these laws are seen as bad, I suppose, is because oftentimes they're old laws. Following the 14th Amendment, a lot of these anti-abortion laws were put into place. I'm all or most. I don't remember if there was one state that partially allowed it, but basically all of America was unified on the issue of abortion before Roe versus Wade, in that it was illegal everywhere. Right? It was banned by the same people who wrote the 14th Amendment and ratified it. That people also went on to ban abortion in the late 1800s. So a lot of the laws are old. The Alabama IVF case was correctly decided given what the law is in Alabama, but that case also is like misrepresented a lot, to the point where even pro-choice people might actually be in favor of like that particular ruling because it was like somebody like uh, walked into a freezer where they weren't supposed to be and destroyed somebody else's embryos that they were going to be using for IVF. So it wasn't like somebody destroying their own embryos or whatever. So I mean, that particular case, people misrepresent. But yeah, I think that if you want different laws, the onus is on you to make new laws, which have been happening, right? I mean, you have Ohio, for example, and many other states adding this into their constitution. And that's the process, right? You don't rely on a shitty case to enforce your rules here. You rely on the process.
Okay. Replies, Rashad and Pixie. Go ahead.
I think there's a couple of things to break down here. I think saying like, oh no, now it's going to be up to like essentially like legislative freedom. They haven't had the freedom before, blah blah blah. Now that's going to happen. I don't think that's necessarily true or the case. For example, like in Arizona, we had the Supreme Court of Arizona try to enforce a law from 1864, I believe. Yeah, 1864, trying to put a near total abortion ban, which seemed to go against the general wishes of the legislator, or at least like polling in that area as well. So to me, that's a clear example of like, oh no, like states trying to do some fuckery when it comes to trying to enforce their belief versus what the general populace wants. I think in Ohio too, before that, Republicans were trying to block what is it? Like essentially general polling that could influence essentially having the abortion ban or not having an abortion ban take place. I also think, on top of all of that, you guys keep saying state rights. You guys keep repeating state rights, state rights, state rights, state rights. My question to you is: does the state have a right to violate your bodily autonomy? Because that's the crux of this issue, right?
I
Um,
mean, so that's kind of the debate: is it actually an enshrined right in the Constitution? If the case, no. If it's not the case, then yes. And the Supreme Court has decided that
did
they're
I
not
frame?
doing that.
Okay.
So
So there's a couple of things that to go down here. First of all, the Constitution, like part of the Constitution, literally states that not all rights are explicitly in the Constitution. I forgot exactly what amendment that is. I know it's in the Bill of Rights. James Madison specifically put that in there because he knew that people would make the argument of, oh, if it's not explicitly in the Constitution, then it's not a right that you can have, which isn't true. Second of all, yeah, basically, if it goes back to a question like bodily autonomy, do you believe people have a right to bodily autonomy?
yeah, of course, but this again, it's not necessarily the question. So the even the court case wasn't necessarily about bodily autonomy; it was about the right to privacy. But the issue with that mentality with it, and just assuming again by asking me the question, "Do you believe people have the right to bodily autonomy?" You're sort of tying in abortion is bodily autonomy. Just because James Madison said some rights are not enshrined directly in the Constitution that exist doesn't mean every right we decide is in the Constitution that isn't is. So that's why we have the Supreme Court, and the overturning of Roe v. Wade was the Supreme Court saying we do not believe there is an implied right to abortion based on your right to medical privacy in the 14th Amendment. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg had backed that up about a decade prior when she even said this Roe v. Wade is going to be on life support. Like it is going to get overturned. It's a poorly argued case. It's very easy to overturn because of how weak the connection is with the actual text of the Constitution. You guys need to legislate it. And so the same thing that you brought up with the Arizona law in 1865, we say, how wild is it that they wanted to institute a law from 1865? That law was on the books. So the Supreme Court upheld the current abortion
Yeah.
law in Arizona.
Laws just don't expire, right?
Yeah.
Like unless there's something in them that's set that like makes them
Or
expire.
unless, as the people of Arizona became more and more progressive on that issue, they had the chance to vote on abortion legislation, but they never did because Roe v.
No,
Wade
they
kept
did.
Arizona from being able to do anything about
Yeah.
it.
Well, 6 days ago,
Yeah,
Arizona
6
did
days ago.
pass. Yeah, 6 days ago, Arizona did vote to repeal that legislation. So they're
No.
doing it via the process.
So imagine if that happened 20 years ago when Arizona probably got progressive enough to repeal that law. We wouldn't even have to have this conversation in 2024.
No, I don't think you guys that I'm not communicating clearly my crux with this issue essentially. You're saying, oh no, the Supreme Court has essentially decided that it is up to the states to decide to legislate this right. And what I'm saying is that even if the Supreme Court decided that, there's a deeper underlying moral issue at play at here, like a
Mhm.
moral issue at hand. If the Supreme Court decided, and I'm going to use a random example just so you guys can see like what I'm getting to. If the Supreme Court decided, hey, you know what, segregation, um, that's up to the states to decide. That's going to be a state rights thing. Like we don't get to decide essentially whether segregation is something that should be decided federally. We're going to let the states decide whether that's moral or not. We
Mhm.
would obviously all come here together and say that's fucked up. People have a fundamental human right when it comes to being treated equally, and that should be regardless of class or regardless of race, essentially, or sex. So if we can agree on the like this basic fundamental idea that there are certain rights that a human being should have, regardless of what state they are in, then it doesn't matter essentially if the Supreme Court decided to like decides that it should be federal or state. I'm asking you guys from a moral standpoint, from the moral issue. Do you guys believe in the right to bodily autonomy?
Oh, if you're asking strictly morally, yes, absolutely. I believe in the right to bodily autonomy for both the woman and the prospective child. So I don't think that at every point in a pregnancy, you are only violating the woman's bodily autonomy when you're making legislation about abortion. I think by not offering certain protections at least certain points in pregnancy, which 90% of the country agrees with me on, you are also violating bodily autonomy of a child. It just depends on which. At what point are you?
Yeah. Yeah. So legally speaking, like constitutionally speaking, legally speaking, there's not really this concept of bodily autonomy. There is this concept of privacy that's kind of strangely applied sometimes, like in Griswold, for example, why birth control is private, but for some reason fentanyl isn't. It's very inconsistent. The same people that drafted the 14th Amendment, again, like the abortion, you mentioned 1864. I mean, this is the same people who later on were ratifying the 14th Amendment, right? So the same people banning abortion were also the ones drafting the amendment that created the right to privacy, arguably, right? Without the 14th Amendment, you don't get the right to privacy. And these people were against abortion. So I don't think it's reasonable to assume that the people who were putting in the right to privacy thought that abortion would be included within that right. My personal moral philosophy, it gets a little bit difficult, right? I think that where it becomes a person is a kind of a difficult argument, a difficult question. I don't really know exactly. I'm thinking probably maybe 8 to 12 weeks personally. But once it is a person, once we have a human being there, a person, then I think that at that point you don't really have a right to abortion. And I kind of liken this to the hypothetical of, yeah, you have a right to your body, but if you pick up a child and or put them in your car and you're driving down the road, you also have a right to your car. But you can't just like in the middle of the highway say, "Oh, this is my car. Get out of my car," and throw the baby out the window, right? You put this person in a position where they need you to survive now. And when you put people in a position where they need you to survive, you have a duty to see them through until they're safe. That's how every law works.
Um, I can respond right now, but if
Please.
Rashad wants
No,
to,
go
okay,
ahead.
I'll go for it.
We'll get
Okay, there's
Rashad
a
in
couple things.
when he's ready. Yeah.
Okay,
Okay, so
okay, do you want to go or should I go?
I'm confused. I don't want to.
Pixie, then Rashad. I'll choose since you can't
Okay,
choose. Okay.
thanks.
Come on, let's go.
Okay.
Pixie.
So let's break it down here. Let's start with the fact that if we can all agree that there's a certain level of bodily autonomy a human being should have, and maybe we can argue that life begins at one point, maybe you lose that right to full bodily autonomy. I'll put this in this corner for now. The fact is that if you believe this is a fundamental human right everybody has, then it makes no sense to say that the state should essentially dictate whether you have that right or not. So essentially, what I'm saying is that we should all, theoretically speaking, here come to an agreement that when it comes to total abortion bans or near total abortion bans, where they're saying like essentially like as early as fucking possible, maybe even right off the bat, just so you find out you're pregnant, you're fucked. That would be a clear violation of bodily autonomy if you believe that's not a baby, essentially. If you believe the pregnant woman still has a right to the bodily autonomy. I also want to say, Lactoid, can you repeat the last point that you made one more time?
You can put
Oh,
yourself in Yeah, you can put yourself in a position where you have a duty to other people if you put them in a position where they need you to survive.
yeah. So it's kind of interesting that you used the example that you did because the first thing that came to my mind was the example I liken it to is that when you go out driving, let's say it's a night, it's kind of rainy, whatever. You decide to go out and drive your car. And then when you do this, you get into a car crash, whatever. Let's say it wasn't really your fault. It was a street. It was, like grimy dirt or like not very well salted, whatever. Maybe it was icy, whatever. You get into a car crash. The other person is now in critical condition. Is the government legally allowed to enforce you to essentially give up your organs or give up some of your blood or essentially connect you to this person that you got into a car crash with for the next 9 months or even longer? Is the government even allowed to potentially alter your body, like, for the rest of your livelihood because of this unfortunate accident?
So right now, that's I would doubt it. I don't think that the government would be able to do that
But
legally
should
speaking.
they?
Yes, I think they should be able to. I think that if you cause an accident, right? So there's gonna be comparison of fault, and obviously this happens for every accident. And if you cause an accident, if you hit somebody and now they need a kidney or now they need like to be hooked up to you for a certain amount of time, you cause them to be in this position. I think you should. I think you should have an obligation to give them your kidney or to hook them up to you
What
because
do you
you
think?
are the one that put them in that position.
Yeah, what do you think, Jib Tan? Same question.
It's a really interesting bullet to bite. I'd have to really, I mean, that's one I would probably have to think about a little bit longer than just like instantaneously on the panel. But for me, I don't like the connection at all because she's trying to sort of do an analogy, but then also take one literal part of the analogy and make it true. The issue with that being the woman was the one who put the child in her body, just like the woman was the one who put the child in the car in Lactoid's analogy. It was her original decision that put the child in that position. Whereas in Pixie's analogy, it wasn't your original choice that attached your body to them in the first place. That's the whole point of the analogy, is we're making it not about the physical body. And she's trying to bridge it in this weird, like, sort of bastardized analogy way where it's half the exact same thing and then half an analogy, and it doesn't really fit.
Well,
The
I
issue with
think
this is the child needs to be attached to your body because you attached the child to your body.
what is it?
Hey,
I
one
think
sec,
the
I gotta
prob
answer my door. Someone's ringing my door.
Really?
okay,
You're gonna
I'll
just drop
Maybe,
that and
maybe,
I'll
go
maybe-
answer the door?
may,
Man,
maybe
look,
she's
you have a
that was
responsibility.
a
You
Chad
have
move,
put
by the
yourself
way.
on my panel. You cannot abort yourself from my panel. Okay? You cannot. We're making a law, a rule right now. That's illegal. Okay. But
But pregnancies don't necessarily have to be intentional, right? Like it's possible to not necessarily be planning for a kid, but to have one. Now we can say, of course, oh, you could have used this or you could have used that, but obviously sometimes things happen, right? Some things happen. Perspectives can change. You can realize you're pregnant and say, wait, I don't really know if I want to have this kid. You could find out the person you're having the kid with was a little bit different than what you thought they were, and now that there's a kid in the equation, and maybe you're not too keen on being connected to that person for the rest of your life through a child. I think things can change. So I don't think Pixie's analogy is entirely too bad because it's really not all that uncommon to accidentally, the act itself of getting pregnant, not necessarily accidental, right? But the fact that you were pregnant wasn't necessarily the intended result. And should you be, held, permanently responsible and forced to keep this child, regardless of circumstances that may change,
Yeah.
perspectives that may change and stuff like that.